Hello everybody, this is Robin. I'm going to do a little lecture here on eligibility for special education, and this is what I've got showing here is the categories from the State of Idaho Manual of Special Education, and you can see there's quite a few categories. I'm just going to highlight a couple of them and sort of point out the difference between Individuals with Disability Education Act and Part 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And the main difference is that for a student to be eligible for special education services, they need to have their disability needs to impact their educational performance. So for instance, a child could be born with cerebral palsy and have some physical disabilities, but not have any cognitive delays and perform fine in school, perform at an appropriate age level. And therefore, the student would be eligible for Part 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, where there would have to be accommodations for the physical disability, but there wouldn't be any measured educational deficit to the physical disability. On the other hand, a child could have been born with cerebral palsy, have cognitive delays and physical delays, and that would then require special education services because it would impact the student's learning. So that's really the difference, is that to be eligible under the federal law of the Individuals with Disability Education Act, the disability specifically needs to impact the performance in school. And also, it needs to be determined according to the state of Idaho. You have to meet the state's eligibility requirements of these specific criteria, from autism through O, visual impairment, including blindness, and special education will benefit that child's learning. So those are the qualifications that students have to meet. So the Idaho Special Education Manual is the state of Idaho's interpretation of the federal law. So it's the rules written to the regulation, the federal regulation. So these are, again, how Idaho interprets that special education law at the federal level. Autism, and I'll be curious to see if with the DSM-5, now that they've changed their definition, the state may respond to that, it may not. Things in special education don't necessarily correlate with things in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, so they're not always quite the same thing. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about cognitive impairment, and you've got here, which is my fine artistic skills. This is supposed to be a bell curve, and across the bottom axis I've got IQ scores, and you can see that the average IQ on most IQ tests is 100 with a standard deviation of 15. And there is some variability, but they kind of will fall along this model. And you can see, if you can read my handwriting, that I've broken it down by the standard deviations. And for a child to be eligible for cognitive impairment, their IQ has to be 2 standard deviations below the mean, so that means an IQ of 70 or lower, and they need to have something called adaptive behaviors, which is also delayed. Adaptive behaviors refers to a child's ability to take care of themselves, social skills, the ability to problem solve, language, it has some language skills in it, to dress oneself, to use the bathroom, things like that are measured. And in Idaho, school psychologists do the IQ testing, and they typically do the adaptive behaviors as well. Although that's not always the case. In Illinois, where I'm from, where I practice school social work, I did the adaptive behavior testing, and the school psychologist did the IQ testing. And I was trained to use a standardized tool called the Vineland, that's Vineland, inventory or measurement tool for adaptive behaviors. And I actually developed a IQ score from that test, just like the IQ test. And we would both report I would need to have measured adaptive behaviors also 2 standard deviations below the mean, so 70 or below, in addition to the IQ score being 70 or below. You can also see in this chart that I have broken down from 70 to 55 is what we call a mild cognitive disability. Or now, of course, the name is intellectual disability on the DSM, but the state of Idaho special education is still calling it cognitive impairment. Then 40 to 55 would be moderate, 25 to 40 would be severe, and profound is usually 25 and below. And with profound, you're talking about kids with really serious, either probably both physical and cognitive delays. A lot of times these kids with IQ scores that low are not able to walk, they may not speak at all, and their individual education plan may actually be something like sensory stimulation. Although, because all children must be educated despite disability, kids like that used to just get sort of shut away in state hospitals, since the 70s when this law was passed, they have to be provided with an education or an individualized education plan. And you can see I've got this area in the blue there where I've got it labeled borderline. And that's IQ between 70 and 85. And that IQ range is often one of the most difficult issues to deal with in the school setting, because kids from that span of intelligence don't do well in the typical curriculum, but they also don't qualify for special education. And so what we see is a curriculum that's designed for kids with an average IQ, and kids who don't have an average IQ aren't able to master the curriculum. And there are some programs for kids, particularly when you have a lot of low income children. You'll have Title I reading and math programs in some schools, and typically these are the kinds of kids they're targeting, where they're not eligible for special education and they're not able to keep up with the regular curriculum. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot for kids like this, and they tend to not do well in school, and unfortunately a lot of them end up dropping out because they just fall further and further behind every year, and it's public schools don't address that group very well at all. And then you can see any IQ that is 85 and above, which is within 1 standard deviation of the mean. The 85 is 1 standard deviation below the mean, is eligible to be considered to have a learning disability. So a kid who has a below average IQ, i.e. below 85, cannot be diagnosed with a learning disability. And learning disabilities are a little tricky, but the bottom line is that they are a discrepancy between ability and achievement. So in other words, you look at the IQ of the child, the school psychologist will test the IQ, and then they will also test the ability and the grade level that the kid is performing at. If the kid is performing significantly below grade level based on their IQ, and also if they have sort of ups and downs in their learning, where they have strengths and weaknesses. And I recommend you take a closer look at how Idaho defines learning disability. It's actually fairly complicated and fairly strict, and in part the reason why it's fairly strict is because a lot of kids were getting labeled learning disabled, and they made the diagnosis of eligibility very clear. Well, it may not be clear, but very specific, and in order to prevent too many kids getting labeled with learning disabilities. And just for your information, I also put up on here that kids in the gifted range, and so that is typically considered an IQ of 145 or higher. And keep in mind that a kid can be gifted and have a learning disability, or they could have an emotional disability, or they could have one of the other impairments from our list. So for instance, they could have a speech or language impairment. And again, I'm not going to go over each and every one of these, but the key point is that the kids have to have something about their impairment or disability interferes with their ability to do well in school or to achieve at grade level, which is, when I say do well in school, I mean achieve at grade level, which is what you want for kids. So anyway, I hope this was helpful in explaining how special education works. If you have, oh, I forgot, I wanted to talk about one more of these, developmental delay. That one is kind of interesting. It's a category, it's a little bit newer, and it's for kids who are between the ages of 3 and 9 years old, and there's not a clear diagnosis, but the child is demonstrating some developmental delays. They could be cognitive, social, emotional, and typically it's more than one area is showing some delay. And the problem is that the testing at those ages from 3 to 9 is not always that good, and it can take a while for the school psychologists and the other people who do the assessments to figure out what exactly a disability is. If a disability is not identified by the time the child is 10 years old, then they can no longer be eligible for special education services. So this developmental delay category is sort of a catch-all for kids who just aren't progressing typically in their development, but we're not sure what's going on with them yet. And so that's actually kind of a nice one, because it used to be if you couldn't figure out they were young, the testing wasn't good, you couldn't figure out what's going on, it was really hard to provide services for a kid. So anyway, forgot about that one. But let me know if you have any questions about this, and I will talk to you later.